Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Ellery and I'm the creator behind Your Anomaly. So a little bit about me. I have been crocheting for 3 years, but I actually learned knitting first. So approximately 7 years ago I started knitting. So I've been involved in fiber arts for a while. I started selling my products in person at markets in early 2025 and have my own online shops with my crochet patterns. So since I have a few years of experience, I thought it would be nice to create a little absolute beginner crochet series. I know that there are a lot of resources already out there, but I wanted to make my own to include tips and tricks that I've learned and that I personally use, along with some of the easier or beginner methods. I will also be making different videos, one more tailored toward garments and working in rows, and one tailored toward amigurumi or crochet plushies. Just as a disclaimer, I am from the US and I work in US crochet terms. If you are a complete beginner with no knowledge of crochet, you might not know that there are multiple sorts of terminology, with 2 English-based systems being US and UK crochet terms. Of course, other languages also have their own crochet terminology, but I wanted to point this out because there are some major differences between US and UK crochet terminology. I believe that US is more common and it can be found in the majority of English-based patterns, but we'll get into that more later, I promise. So for the first video of this series and my first ever YouTube video ever, so if I sound nervous, it's because I am. I just wanted to review some of the stuff that you'll need to get started. You will need a crochet hook, and then you will need some yarn. My recommendation to complete beginners of crochet has always been a 5mm hook. They can also be identified by letters and numbers. So a 5mm hook is the same exact thing as a USH or an 8. In my experience, most patterns refer to the hook by the millimeter size, but it is always good to keep it in mind. There are a lot of charts online showing the equivalents, and it's always an easy Google search away, so if you're ever confused, it is pretty easy to find an answer. So this is my 5mm hook. I find it extremely beginner friendly as it's a good size and works well with worsted weight acrylic. I prefer the Susan Bates brand, if you can see. Now, these ones are inline crochet hooks, so they have a more pointed tip, which mine looks dull because I use it all the time. But the pointed tips are helpful for if you have really tight tension. I personally do have really tight tension when I crochet, so the pointed tip helps you get into stitches easier. I'll hold up another non-inline hook in a moment to compare, but for this one, the head of the crochet hook is in line, get it, with the rest of the hook. You can see that the groove is also deeper, so it is a lot easier to catch the yarn when you're crocheting. So this is a lot different than a regular tapered crochet hook. So this one is a size 4, also an F, but this is a tapered crochet hook. So you can see that it's narrower than the inline and it curves inward some more. The groove is also not as deep and it has a more rounded tip. So honestly, you can use either. Here is them side by side. You can see that this one has a deeper groove, it's more pointed. The head of this hook comes out more from the body, whereas the inline is inline. So you can use either. I would recommend trying out different crochet hooks to see which ones you like the most. Again, my favorite are the Susan Bates. These are the soft ergonomic inline hooks. There are also very popular brands out there like Clover Amour. So I would really just recommend trying different crochet hooks to figure out which ones you like the best. As you can see, the majority of my crochet hooks are Susan Bates. It's just my favorite. I prefer it. I much prefer the inline hooks compared to a tapered one. I do have a different 7mm crochet hook. It is the Knit Pro This one is interchangeable, so this screws off, but I keep it on. I bought this specifically because I don't think a 7mm Susan Bates inline hook exists. So this is the only inline hook that I have that is not Susan Bates. It works pretty well. The handle is short, so I tend to put it in a longer sleeve, so then it is easier to crochet with. Otherwise, it works the same. You can also always go with the Michaels brand. I believe their crochet hooks are loops and threads. If you're very new to crochet, I would advise you to not immediately invest in expensive crochet hooks, not only because you might not like working with them, but if you end up finding that crochet isn't for you, you won't be out of much money if you just get a simple 5mm hook from Michaels. There are other options. There are plastic hooks, which you can find at like the Dollar Tree, but I do not recommend using those because they're flimsy and they're not well made. And from what I've seen, they have like ridges on the side, plastic ridges, which catches on yarn. I personally would go with a metal crochet hook. Moving on to the yarn. There are so many types of yarn, but because this is a beginner-themed video, I'm going to start with what I recommend for absolute beginners. So, honestly, I recommend beginning with acrylic yarn. I know some people are going to boo me for this one since there are some pretty avid acrylic haters out there, but you do you. That's cool. I always suggest acrylic yarn for beginners because it is very cheap and extremely accessible. If you don't have a Michaels or other local craft store, you can often find acrylic yarn in places like the Dollar Tree or Walmart. I personally love Big Twist acrylic. This can now be found at Michaels. It was originally the Joann's brand. R.I.P. We miss her so much. But you can also get the Michaels Loops and Thread brand. That's also pretty good. I will say that while Red Heart, another brand that often does acrylic, I don't know if they only do acrylic, but they do a lot of acrylic. They have a lot of cool colors like the granny square yarn, and they have ombre options, and they're really pretty colors. They're really cool. The texture of that yarn is extremely scratchy and rough, so I would avoid making a wearable, like a cardigan, out of that. So if you have a texture issue, I would avoid that one. If you don't, you can pick it up at a Walmart, and it's really, really cheap. So it is a very inexpensive yarn to start with. But if you have sensory issues, please do not buy that. You're going to hate working with the yarn, and you're going to hate crocheting. Okay, so here's the deal with yarn. Each yarn comes with a label, and it is very important for you to pay attention to what is on that label. So I'm just going to point out some of the important things on yarn labels that you should look out for. Number one, this is the brand. It's Big Twist. And then the yarn collection is Value. So Big Twist Value is their acrylic brand. If we keep turning the skein, we can see the yardage. So this is really important if you're following a pattern. So let's say you're trying to make a cardigan pattern and the creator of the pattern lists how much yarn they use to make a certain size. You can use that to figure out how many skeins of the yarn you're choosing you need. So these symbols might look a little scary and confusing. This one I'm going to ignore for now because this is for knitting, so I'm just going to cover that. This is for crochet. You can see it has a hook in the middle, and then there are the numbers. So for this yarn, the brand recommends a 5mm or US-H or US-8 hook. I will get more into that in a second regarding what size hook to use, but this is what the brand recommends. The numbers on the outside are gauge swatches. This is for making a gauge swatch. So if you used a 5mm hook with this specific yarn, 13 single crochet across, 14 rows, it should be these measurements if you have proper gauge. I will be completely honest, I never do a gauge swatch. If I end up making the wrong size, I just accept my fate and I start over. But if you do want to make sure you're doing it properly, if you want to ensure that the garment or item that you're making is the correct size, follow this. If what you ended up with is smaller, you should size up a hook. If what you ended up was bigger, you should size down. If you're still having issues, might be a tension thing. It really is, you just have to figure it out, unfortunately. So this is a weight 4 yarn, also known as a medium weight yarn, also known as a worsted weight yarn. It can seem really confusing. You will pick it up the more that you look at different yarn labels. This is important so you know what weight you're working with and then what hook, because if you use a bulky yarn, you will need to size up your hook most of the time. Not necessarily an amigurumi, but if this were a weight 6, this would probably be bigger. So this just lets you know the weight of the yarn, and that's really important if you're following a pattern. Continuing on, this is, I don't think this is on most yarn labels, but Big Twist does this. This is the skeins they recommend per project. And then they do put here, please purchase a sufficient quantity of 1 dye lot to ensure uniformity of color in your completed project. So this actually leads me into the next important part. This is the color, baby pink. You can pretty much tell. This right here is the dye lot. This is very important if you're making a large project that uses the same colorway of yarn. So if you're making a big project, so let's say you're trying to make this blanket. It recommends 4 skeins of yarn. I would double check with your pattern again to make sure you're buying the correct amount. I would always recommend buying slightly more than you're expecting to use. So if this suggests 4 skeins, I would honestly buy 5. But I also do love buying yarn, so that might be a me issue. This here is very important. If you decide to buy 1 skein of yarn and you need 4 skeins to make the blanket and you're like, I'll buy the other 3 later, this is the information you need to know. Because sometimes there isn't an issue if there are different lots, but sometimes there is. You can see the dye lot number when it was manufactured. If I want to make that big blanket and I only bought 1 skein of yarn and then I finish that skein and I'm like, okay, I need to go buy the other one so I can be financially responsible and only buy 1 skein at a time. It's possible if you get a dye lot, a different dye lot, this color could be darker or lighter, so it may not perfectly match this skein. So then my blanket will be multiple different colors. If you want to ensure that you do not run out of the same colorway and the same dye lot, I would buy multiple skeins of yarn from the store at the same time for that project and make sure the dye lots match. I'm sure it's possible for yarns in the same dye lot to have different variations of color, but I think it's a lot less likely than if you just picked up a random skein and then it probably wouldn't match. So that is really important. If you're making a big project, make sure you are buying enough of the same lot of yarn so the colors aren't different. So when I said that these sizes are recommended, you don't have to use those. So for a weight 4 acrylic yarn, it might recommend a 5mm hook. That's just recommended. So it's kind of like how recipes are general guidelines. If I wanted the stitches to be bigger and maybe if I were trying to make a mesh sweater, I would size up my hook. If I wanted tighter stitches for something like amigurumi, I would size down my hook. A general rule of thumb is the bigger the hook you use, the bigger the stitches in the gaps, and the smaller hook you use, the smaller and tighter the stitches. So in the case of amigurumi, you want to use a smaller hook than is recommended just to ensure that there are no gaps when you put in stuffing. I will be doing another video specifically on crochet stitches as well as tension, so stay tuned for that. So, is this everything that I would recommend a beginner have to start crochet? No. This is what you need at a bare minimum to crochet. There are some other things that I definitely recommend that you get, especially if you're a beginner. One of these is a stitch marker. So these can be used to track your place in your project or mark specific places that might be helpful. For a beginner, this might be the first and last stitch of a row. I personally use stitch markers when I'm working in the round. I always mark the last stitch of the round. You can also mark the first stitch, whichever you prefer, but that's how I do it. For a beginner, I would definitely recommend stitch markers that lock so they don't slip off easy. There are stitch markers that you can just twist on, but for a beginner, I would probably say one that locks so it doesn't slip off of your stitch and you lose your place and then everything is ruined. Everything wouldn't be ruined, but you know, that's how it feels. Another thing that I would recommend is a darning needle or a tapestry needle. You can use a plastic one or a metal one. I would always recommend having one bigger one for chunkier weight yarn and then a smaller one for thinner yarn. This one has yarn on it because I used it to tack down super glue and now it's super glued yarn on there, so not cool. I would also always recommend scissors or something sharp to cut the yarn when you're done. So bare minimum, these two. What I would recommend, tapestry needle, darning needle. This is for when you're ending the project and you need to weave in your ends, locking stitch markers, and scissors. So those are really the absolute basics in my opinion. I will be making more videos on basic crochet stitches, both for regular crochet, such as wearables, accessories, blankets, etc., as well as for amigurumi, which are crochet plushies. So if you're interested in following along for those tutorials, I will be using a 5mm crochet hook and a weight for acrylic yarn in a light color. I will not be using white and I will not be using black because it's a little difficult to see the stitches, especially for a beginner. So I will probably be using this orange color because it's bright. You can also substitute the acrylic for a cotton yarn, but just note that cotton is typically stiffer than acrylic and it has less stretch, so it might be more difficult to use if you're a beginner. I will have a small material list on the screen here as well as in the description, so if you'd like to grab these supplies to work with me, that information will be there. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about anything I've mentioned here or the crochet process at all, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If it's about this video, I'll do my best to reply to your comment. If it's something that you would like brought up in future how-to videos, I'll do my best to include it. So I look forward to seeing you again in the next video. Bye!